Past saving. That's what the kid behind the counter told him. 3 young gunsmiths, none of them older than 28, took one look at the rusted M1 bayonet lying on the felt mat, and the oldest of them, the one with the trim beard and calloused hands, leaned back from his workbench and said the blade was scrap. Pitting that deep eats into the hardened steel, he said. You can't put back metal that's already gone. He said it kindly enough. He said it the way you talk to a confused old man who doesn't understand that some things are simply beyond fixing. The 78-year-old standing on the other side of the counter didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change the expression on his weathered face. He just nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've heard something 1,000 times before and have stopped trying to correct it. Then he asked, very politely, if he could trouble them for the use of one of their back workbenches for the afternoon. What those 3 young gunsmiths watched unfold over the next 4 hours would leave them standing silently behind an old man, watching him work, slowly realizing that they had just dismissed someone whose hands had forgotten more about their trade than they would ever learn. If you believe that a craftsman should never be judged by the dust on his boots, if you believe the men who built this country with their hands deserve our respect no matter how thin their hair has gone, or how slow their step has become, type the word honour in the comments before this story goes any further. Let them know you're listening. His name was Harold Whitfield, and on the Saturday morning everything began, he was breaking ground for a new tomato bed at the back of his 1/4-acre lot in a small town outside of Roanoke, Virginia. He was 78 years old. He lived alone in a clapboard house his late wife Margaret had picked out 46 years earlier, and he kept the place tidy in the quiet, methodical way of men who have spent their entire working lives organising tools on a pegboard. The neighbours knew him as a soft-spoken widower who waved from his front porch and brought casseroles to anyone who lost someone. They did not know what he had done for a living before he retired. He had never told them, and they had never thought to ask. That morning his garden spade struck something solid about 8 inches under the dirt. The metal-on-metal sound was unmistakable to him, and the fact that he recognised it before he even saw what it was should have told him something. He knelt down slowly, with some difficulty, and brushed the soil away with the side of his hand the way a man brushes away years. What was buried in the dark Virginia earth, mottled with 50 years of rust and root damage, was the unmistakable silhouette of an M1 bayonet. The blade was pitted, the grip scales were rotted away into damp fibres that came apart between his fingers. The pommel was a black-scaled lump barely recognisable as machined metal, but the shape was there, the fuller, the false edge, the angle of the crossguard. Harold knew that shape the way another man might know the silhouette of a face he had loved. He carried the bayonet inside without saying a word to anyone, washed it gently in the kitchen sink with cold water and a soft brush, laid it on a folded dish towel on the counter, and stood there for a long time looking at it. The kitchen clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed. Harold Whitfield did not move for almost 20 minutes. Whatever was passing through his mind during those 20 minutes, he never told anybody. The next morning he drove 40 minutes east, the bayonet carefully wrapped in a clean cotton flour sack on the passenger seat, to the nearest gun shop with a posted restoration service. It was a clean, well-lit place, the kind of shop that displayed engraved 1911s in glass cases and sold high-end knife steel by the bar. The 3 young men working the back bench were all serious, well-trained smiths. They had degrees from technical schools. They subscribed to the trade journals. They had done custom work for collectors who paid 4 figures for a single blade refinish. When Harold Whitfield walked in wearing his canvas barn coat and the cap from a feed store that had closed in 1998, they categorised him in about 2 seconds. Old man, sentimental project, probably a grandfather's keepsake. They had seen 100 of him. They knew exactly what he was going to ask for, and they knew exactly what they were going to tell him. He set the bayonet down on the felt mat and didn't say a word. He let them look. The first one, the youngest, with the buzz cut and the company polo, picked it up by the crossguard, turned it over twice, and chuckled out loud before he could stop himself. The second one shook his head and said he supposed he could clean it up enough to sell as a wall hanger if the customer wasn't too picky. The third one, the one with the trim beard, was the most senior and tried to be gentle about it. He told the old man honestly that the blade was past saving. He explained, slowly and a little louder than necessary, that pitting that deep into the hardened high-carbon steel meant the metal was structurally compromised, that no responsible smith would call it a restoration, and that anyone who told him otherwise was selling him a lie. Harold listened to every word. He nodded politely. He thanked them for their honesty. and then he asked if he could trouble them for the use of one of their back workbenches and a few of their basic tools just for the afternoon. He would pay the bench fee. He would clean up after himself. He simply wanted, he said, to see what could be done. The shop owner, a man in his 50s named Darrell, who was watching the whole exchange from his office doorway, found himself half amused and half curious. He waved his hand and told the old man to take the bench by the side window. "Don't touch the CNC. Don't break anything. Holler if you need acetone." Harold Whitfield walked back to the bench. He set down the cotton flour sack. And then, very slowly and very carefully, he opened a small leather roll he had been carrying inside his coat. The three young smiths happened to be glancing over at that moment, and what they saw inside that leather roll caused all three of them to stop talking at the same time. It was a set of files. But not the kind of files you buy at a hardware store. They were old. The handles were hand-turned hardwood, dark with the oil of decades of palm sweat. There were Swiss pattern needle files in sizes the catalogues no longer carry. There was a pillar file with a maker's mark stamped into the tang that the bearded smith squinted at and didn't recognize. There were 3 Arkansas stones in a small wooden case, each one perfectly flat, the kind of stones that take a lifetime to wear in correctly. And there was a small, brass-handled scribe with a name engraved on the side. The smiths were too far away to read the engraving, but they could read the leather roll itself, which was old and stained and clearly older than any of them, and which had been folded and unfolded by the same pair of hands 10,000 times. The old man set up an electrolysis bath. He did it with a glass mason jar, a length of old copper wire, a tablespoon of washing soda from a small Ziploc bag he produced from his coat, and a battery charger he asked Darrell very politely to borrow. He used a piece of sacrificial mild steel as the anode and clipped the bayonet suspended on a wire as the cathode. The setup took him about 6 minutes. The bearded smith, whose name was Ben, found himself standing about 10 feet behind the bench watching, because he had read about electrolysis derusting in a magazine once, but had never actually seen anyone in the shop do it. Within 40 minutes the bayonet had come out of the bath transformed. The black scale and the loose corrosion were gone. What was left was the actual underlying steel, dark grey and pitted but solid. The shape of the maker's mark on the ricasso, the small flat section of the blade just above the crossguard, was now faintly visible. The youngest smith, the one with the buzz cut, came over and stood next to Ben without saying anything. Both of them watched the old man work. The next thing Harold Whitfield did was the thing that broke them. He reached into a paper bag he had brought in from his truck and took out 2 pieces of walnut. They were grip scales. He had carved them the night before. Ben could tell by the freshness of the cut and the faint smell of walnut oil still on the wood. And he had carved them by hand with no power tools in the exact correct dimension and contour for a 1944 pattern M1 bayonet grip. The checkering pattern was not the modern crosshatch diamond. It was the old wartime pattern, the sharper, slightly irregular cut that came off a hand chisel rather than a CNC bit. The young smiths walked over and stood directly behind him now. They didn't pretend not to be watching anymore. The third smith, the one who had said he could sell it as a wall hanger, quietly went over to the front of the shop and turned the open sign around to closed, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. Darrell came out of the office and stood in the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. The last thing Harold Whitfield did was draw the edge. He clamped the blade gently in a padded vise and laid one of his Arkansas stones across the bevel at an angle Ben would later describe as having been so perfect it looked geometric. He worked it in long, slow, even strokes. He did not look at the blade. He looked at a spot on the wall about 3 feet above the bench, the way a man looks past his hands when his hands no longer need his eyes. The bevel that came up under his stones was the original factory bevel, the slightly compound grind that the wartime contract specified, the one that almost no modern smith bothers to reproduce because it takes 3 times longer than a flat secondary. The blade emerged with a satin finish, an even edge, and a quiet, lethal symmetry that the 3 young men in the room recognized as something they had only ever seen in textbooks and museum displays. None of them had ever watched it being done. When Harold finally laid the finished bayonet on the felt mat next to the photograph he had taken on his phone that morning of what it had looked like emerging from the dirt, the shop went absolutely silent. Darrell walked slowly across the floor and stopped at the bench. He looked down at the bayonet. He looked up at the old man, and he asked the question all 3 of his young smiths were afraid to ask out loud. He asked who Harold Whitfield was. The old man smiled for the first time all afternoon. It was a small, tired, almost private smile, and it changed his whole face. He said his name was Harold. He said he had spent 35 years as a master armourer at Springfield Armory before it was decommissioned, and another 12 after that as a civilian consultant to the Marine Corps Small Arms Program at Quantico. He said he had personally inspected and repaired roughly 40,000 military-edged weapons over the course of his working life, and he had been trained in his trade, beginning at the age of 17, by a German master smith named Klaus Brenner, who had himself been trained at Solingen before the war. He said the leather roll the young men were looking at had been Klaus Brenner's, given to him on the day Klaus retired in 1971. He said the brass scribe with the engraved name on the side had Klaus Brenner's name on it. And then, very quietly, he picked up the bayonet and turned it over and showed Ben the maker's mark on the ricasso, the one all three of them had missed, because the rust had still partly obscured it when they first looked. It was a small UFH inside an oval. Harold told them it stood for Utica Cutlery, the H denoting a specific contract subcontractor. He told them this exact mark, in this exact font, was used only on a 1944 contract lot of approximately 14,000 bayonets that were issued to the 29th Infantry Division in the spring of that year. And he told them, with no particular drama in his voice, that the 29th Infantry Division had landed at Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, and that this bayonet, judging by the depth of the soil it had been buried in, the pattern of the corrosion, and the place it had been found, had almost certainly come home in a footlocker with a man who had carried it across that beach. Nobody spoke. The youngest smith sat down on a stool. Ben took off his shop apron and folded it over his arm slowly, the way a man might remove his hat in a church. Darrell turned his face away for a moment and rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. Harold Whitfield stood quietly in the late afternoon light coming through the side window, the bayonet in his hands, and didn't seem to need any of them to say anything at all. After a long minute, Ben finally found his voice. He said he was sorry. He said he was sorry for what he had said earlier, and for how he had said it, and for the way he had looked at the old man when he had first walked in the door. Harold shook his head gently and told him there was nothing to be sorry for. He told Ben that he had been 26 years old once himself, and that at 26 he too had thought he knew everything there was to know about steel. He said the only difference between Ben and the man Ben would be in 50 years was the number of mistakes Ben was lucky enough to make and learn from. Then he asked Ben if he wanted to learn how to cut the wartime checkering pattern by hand. By closing time, none of the three young smiths had gone home. Darrell had cleared the front display case, the one that normally held the high-end engraved 1911s, and had laid the restored bayonet in the middle of it on a piece of dark blue velvet, with the photograph of the rusted blade beside it for context, and a small handwritten card that simply read, "Restored by H. Whitfield, Master Armourer, Springfield Armory, Rurestas, 2024. Harold spent the next 3 hours at the back bench, sleeves rolled up, teaching three young men what their trade had looked like before the manuals forgot. He showed Ben how to read the grain of walnut to know which way the checkering would cut cleanest. He showed the youngest smith how to feel the temperature of a quench by the sound it made. He showed the third smith how to identify a 1903 Springfield bolt face from across a room. They asked questions. They took notes. They did not look at their phones once. When Harold finally drove home that evening, the bayonet was no longer with him. He had given it to the shop. He told Darrell it belonged in the case more than it belonged on his mantelpiece, because a young person walking past it might stop and ask a question, and a question was the only way any of this got passed down. Darrell tried to pay him for it. Harold refused. He drove the 40 minutes back to his small clapboard house, made himself a sandwich, sat on his back porch in the dark, and looked out at the patch of dirt where the new tomato bed was going to go. He thought, for the first time in many years, about Klaus Brenner. He thought about the soldier whose hands had last carried that bayonet, and about the long, slow, accidental journey of a piece of steel from a beach in Normandy to a quarter-acre garden in Virginia, 80 years and one ocean apart. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason an old man's spade had struck something solid that Saturday morning. Maybe nothing was ever really past saving. 2 weeks later, Ben drove out to Harold's house unannounced, with a leather notebook and a thermos of coffee, and asked if the old master armourer would be willing to take on an apprentice on Saturdays. Harold opened the door, looked at the notebook, looked at the young man holding it, and stepped aside to let him in. The shop in Roanoke now hosts a free monthly workshop for veterans and young smiths, taught by a 78-year-old man in a feed store cap on the tools and techniques that built the small arms that won a war. The display case at the front of the store still holds the bayonet, and the handwritten card beside it has never been replaced. If you believe that the men and women who built this country with their hands, the quiet ones, the unassuming ones, the ones in the worn coats and the old caps who never tell you what they used to be, deserve our respect, our attention, and our willingness to listen before we judge, then subscribe to this channel. We tell their stories here every week. We tell them because someone has to, and because the day we stop telling them is the day we forget who we are. Share this story with a veteran in your life. Tell them, from one stranger to another, that we see them. And the next time an old man sets something on a counter in front of you and asks for a little of your time, give it to him. You may be standing in front of a master, and you may not even know it.